We are often taught that evolution is a slow, grinding machine, a process that takes millions of years to change a single feature, gradual, silent, invisible. But deep in our DNA, there is evidence of something else. About 7,000 years ago, at the exact moment the first great civilizations were rising in Sumer, when the Anunnaki myths say gods were walking the earth, and when the first cities were being etched into the clay of Mesopotamia, something inexplicable was happening in the West. A biological anomaly. A change so rapid, so radical, and so widespread that it literally rewrote the human genetic code in the blink of an evolutionary eye. It wasn't a slow drift, it was a sudden rewrite. We are talking about one of the most mysterious transformations in our species' history. The story of how and why humans suddenly changed color. If you are using these reflections to drift into the deep past, consider subscribing. Tell me where you are in this timeline and what truths you are searching for. I read the signals from the dark Stockholm at sunrise, Sydney at sunset, all happening at once. The world is a strange, collapsed geography. Is it not? Picture this. Cast your mind back. About 70,000 years ago, 70,000 years, a small group of early humans, our ancestors, left the African continent. They began one of the most extraordinary journeys in the history of life on Earth. These were not the first hominids to venture beyond the boundaries of Africa, but they were the ones that mattered for us. They were the direct ancestors of every single person living outside of Africa today. And here is the thing. Here is the detail that should stop you in your tracks. Every single one of these early migrants had dark skin. Every one of them. Not brown, not tan, not the olive complexion of the Mediterranean, but deeply pigmented, melanin-rich skin. Skin that would look completely familiar in modern sub-Saharan Africa today. This was the baseline. This was the human norm. Now fast forward. Fast forward through the millennia to the present day. Look at the descendants of those same migrants. Today you have billions of people with skin so light it burns within minutes of exposure to the intense sun. You have populations in Scandinavia who are practically translucent. Northern Europeans whose skin is so pale, so devoid of pigment, that you can see the intricate web of blue blood vessels pulsing just beneath the surface. How did this happen? How did the direct descendants of deeply dark-skinned Africans become some of the lightest-skinned organisms on the planet? How did we go from obsidian to alabaster? The answer is not what most people think. It is not what you were likely taught in school. It is not simply about cold weather. It is not about the ice. And it is not about a slow, gradual fading over hundreds of thousands of years. The real story is far more recent. The real story is far more dramatic. And the real story involves evolutionary pressures so intense, so unforgiving, that they literally rewrote the human genome in the blink of an evolutionary eye. See, when we talk about human evolution, we are conditioned to think in deep time. We think in millions of years. We think of Homo erectus walking upright 2 million years ago. We think of the slow, grinding development of language over hundreds of thousands of years. We think of evolution as a glacier, slow, imperceptible, ancient. But skin color, the evolution of skin color happened yesterday. In evolutionary terms, it happened moments ago. We are talking about changes so recent, so sudden, that your own ancestors, people who lived just 150 generations ago, might have looked completely different from you. 150 generations. That is nothing. That is a heartbeat in the history of our kind. Here is what is truly wild. Here is the revelation that recent science has gifted us. Recent analysis of ancient DNA genetic material pulled from the bones of the long dead has revealed something that completely overturns everything we thought we knew about the history of European skin. Are you ready for this? Europeans were still dark-skinned, well into recorded history. Let that sink in. We are not talking about the Stone Age. We are not talking about the deep, forgotten mists of prehistory. We are talking about people living in Europe just 3,000 years ago. 3,000 years ago, during the Bronze Age, when great civilizations were already rising, when monuments were being built, when written language was being scratched onto tablets, when stories were being told that we still remember. At that time, many Europeans still carried the skin of their African ancestors. Archaeological sites across the continent have yielded DNA from hundreds of ancient individuals, and the results are not just surprising, they are staggering. Consider the hunter-gatherers living in Spain 8,500 years ago, 8,500 years ago. They had darker skin than most modern Africans do today. Consider the famous Cheddar Man found in England dating back 10,000 years. Dark skin and blue eyes. A combination that basically does not exist in modern Europeans. A phenotype that has vanished. A ghost of a different Europe. But here is where the puzzle deepens. Here is where the story gets even more interesting. While most ancient Europeans maintained their dark skin for thousands of years, after their ancestors first arrived on the continent, there were exceptions. There were pockets of change. 7 individuals from a site in southern Sweden, dating to 7,700 years ago, already possessed the genetic variants for light skin. They already carried the genes for blue eyes. So we have a map that is not uniform. We have a timeline that is not straight. This creates a puzzle, a mystery that scientists are still untangling. The traditional explanation for human skin color variation seemed so straightforward, didn't it? It seemed so elegant. Dark skin protects against ultraviolet radiation in sunny climates. It is a shield. Light skin allows more vitamin D synthesis in northern latitudes where the sunlight is weak. It is a solar panel. Simple, logical, tidy. Dark skin for the sun, light skin for the dark. Except the timing does not add up. The timing breaks the theory. If skin color was just about adapting to local UV levels, if it was just about the latitude, why did it take so long? Modern humans reached Europe at least 45,000 years ago. They walked into the north. They lived under those gray skies. If light skin was such a massive advantage in those northern climates, why were Europeans still dark-skinned 30,000 years later? Why did they wait? Why did evolution pause? The answer lies in understanding that human skin color, evolution is not just about geography. It is not just about where you are on the map. It is about a complex interplay, a dance between genetics, diet, migration, and evolutionary pressures that most people never consider. To understand the white skin of the North, we must first understand the dark skin of the South. The story begins not with humans leaving Africa, but with why they evolved dark skin in the first place. Go back further. Our earliest human ancestors were covered in hair. They were furred like modern chimpanzees. Beneath that fur, their skin was likely pale. But sometime around 2 million years ago, something remarkable happened. Humans began to strip. We began losing our body hair. We began developing the ability to sweat profusely. This was a revolutionary adaptation. It was a superpower for life on the African savanna. It allowed our ancestors to hunt during the heat of the day, to run when most predators were resting panting in the shade. But hairless skin created a new problem. Naked skin created a vulnerability. Without the protection of fur, early humans were exposed to the full, unblinking fury of the tropical sun. They were exposed to intense ultraviolet radiation. And this UV exposure, it wasn't just uncomfortable. It wasn't just a sunburn. It was potentially lethal. It was lethal not just because it burned, but because it erased the future. Ultraviolet radiation does more than damage the skin surface. It penetrates. It damages DNA. It causes cancer. But perhaps most critically for the brutal logic of evolution, it destroys folate. Folate, a simple B vitamin, but a vitamin that is absolutely essential for the continuation of the species. It is required for proper sperm production in men. It is required for healthy fetal development in women. It is the fuel of reproduction. UV radiation breaks down folate in the bloodstream like sunlight dissolving ink. And folate deficiency, it can cause devastating birth defects, neural tube defects, spina bifida. In evolutionary terms, anything that impacts reproduction is the ultimate judge. Anything that reduces your ability to pass on life gets eliminated, fast, ruthlessly. So the sun became the enemy, and the body needed a shield. The solution was melanin, this remarkable molecule, this ancient biological technology. It acts like a natural sunscreen, absorbing the radiation, scattering the energy, before it can slice through the DNA, before it can destroy the folate. Dark-skinned individuals can withstand 20 to 30 times more UV exposure than light-skinned individuals without suffering folate depletion. In the intense hammering sun of ancient Africa, dark skin was not just an advantage. It was not a cosmetic preference. It was a requirement. It was the uniform of survival. The genetics behind this adaptation are fascinating. The MC1R gene, the architect of melanin production, underwent strong, unyielding positive selection in early humans. Research suggests that this genetic foundation, this armor of pigment, arose at least 1.2 million years ago. It was forged in the deep past and inherited by all anatomically modern humans. So when the first humans left Africa 70,000 years ago, they carried this armor with them. They carried the dark skin of their ancestors. So why didn't they keep it? Why did they lose the shield? The answer brings us to one of the most important and perhaps most delicate molecules in human biology, vitamin D. Vitamin D is strange. Unlike most vitamins which we harvest from the food we eat, vitamin D is primarily synthesized in our own bodies. It is made in our skin, but it is made only when that skin is kissed by ultraviolet radiation. This presents an evolutionary dilemma, a tug of war. You need UV exposure to make vitamin D. You must let the light in, but too much UV destroys folate. You must keep the light out. Dark skin protects the folate. It blocks the light. Light skin allows the vitamin D. It welcomes the light, but it leaves the folate vulnerable. In tropical Africa, this was not a problem. The sun is so fierce, so abundant, that even heavily pigmented skin, even the darkest shield, can let in enough UV to produce adequate vitamin D. The balance was easy, but as humans moved north, as they walked away from the equator, as they moved to higher latitudes where the sun hangs low and weak in the sky, the equation changed. The balance shifted dramatically. Suddenly, dark skin was no longer just a shield. It became a barrier. It became a liability. Vitamin D deficiency is not a minor inconvenience. It is not just about feeling tired. It is about the architecture of the body. It affects immune function. It affects muscle development. It affects reproductive health. Severe deficiency causes rickets, a disease that softens the bones, that bows the legs, that deforms the pelvis. And in a pre-modern world, a deformed pelvis made childbirth extremely difficult. Often, it made it impossible. In pre-modern societies, vitamin D deficiency was often a death sentence. So the pressure began to build. The pressure to lighten. The pressure to let the sun in. But here is the crucial point. Here is the detail that resolves the mystery of the timing. The evolutionary pressure for light skin only became intense, only became a matter of life and death when humans adopted agriculture. Think about the hunter-gatherers. Think about those dark-skinned people living in Spain and England thousands of years ago. How did they survive the north with dark skin? They survived because of their diet. Hunter-gatherers living in northern climates obtained vitamin D from their food. They ate the livers of fish. They ate the blubber of marine mammals. They ate the wild game that was rich in the nutrient. They didn't need their skin to make it. They ate it. So for thousands of years, the dark skin could remain. It wasn't a liability yet. But then the world changed. Humans began to farm. They began to rely primarily on plant foods, grains, cereals. And grains do not contain vitamin D. Suddenly the dietary source was gone. Suddenly the only way to get this vital molecule was from the sun. And suddenly dark skin was a fatal flaw. This explains the timing. This explains why the change happened when it did. The major shift toward lighter skin pigmentation in Europe coincided almost perfectly with the spread of Neolithic farming. It coincided with the arrival of farmers from Anatolia, beginning around 8,000 years ago. These early farmers brought more than just seeds. They brought more than just the plow. They brought the genetic variants for lighter skin. They brought the mutations that would save them in a grain-based world. The gene known as SLC24A5 represents one of the most important of these changes. A single mutation. One tiny alteration in the code. This single mutation is responsible for 25 to 40% of the skin color difference between Europeans and West Africans. And this mutation became fixed in European populations through incredibly strong positive selection. When geneticists look at this gene, they see the fingerprints of necessity. They see one of the most powerful examples of natural selection in recent human history. But SLC24A5 was not working alone. Another gene, SLC45A2, underwent similar changes. Together, these genetic modifications fundamentally altered the machinery of the skin. They changed how melanin was produced. They changed how it was distributed. The result was a dramatic reduction in pigmentation, a fading of the shield, and it occurred with breathtaking speed. In evolutionary terms, it was an explosion. The archaeological evidence paints a picture of a wave of pale skin washing over the continent. Genetic analysis shows that light skin alleles spread through Central and Southern Europe around 8,000 years ago. Then they continued spreading northward. By 5,000 years ago, these variants were becoming common. By 3,000 years ago, light skin had become the predominant phenotype across much of Europe. This was not a slow drift. This was not a lazy river of change. This was a flood. Populations were literally changing color, not over millions of years, but fast enough that the memory of the old look might have lingered in oral histories. New genetic variants swept through them, carried by the farmers, driven by the need for vitamin D, selected by the unforgiving hand of nature. But Europe. Europe was not the only place where this drama was unfolding. Halfway around the world, something equally remarkable was happening. East Asian populations were undergoing their own transformation. They too were moving north. They too were facing the weak sun. And they too were evolving lighter skin. But here is what is truly beautiful about evolution. Here is what reveals its improvisational genius. They did it differently. They evolved lighter skin through completely different genetic pathways. While Europeans were using mutations in SLC24A5 and SLC45A2, East Asians were modifying entirely different genes. The OCA2 gene, the MFSD12 gene. These played the crucial roles in East Asian skin lightening. This is what scientists call convergent evolution. Different tools, same result. Similar environmental pressures led to similar outcomes, but through completely different genetic routes. This tells us something profound about human adaptation. It tells us that the body is not a fixed blueprint. When evolutionary pressures are strong enough, life finds a way. The human genome is remarkably plastic. It is capable of responding to environmental challenges through multiple independent pathways. It is a shapeshifter. What happened to human skin color wasn't a single evolutionary event. It wasn't a one-time miracle. It was parallel evolution. It was occurring simultaneously in different populations, separated by vast distances, each using the genetic tools they had at hand to solve the same solar puzzle. The story of the MFSD12 gene is particularly fascinating. It connects the story of Asian skin not just to the north, but to the New World. This gene underwent natural selection in East Asian populations after they split from Europeans around 40,000 years ago. And when ancient peoples crossed the Bering Land Bridge, when they walked into the Americas, they carried these variants with them. They carried the genetic memory of that Asian adaptation into a new hemisphere. Modern genetic studies reveal the incredible complexity of this pigmentation architecture. We now know that skin color is controlled by at least 15 different genes, 15 levers, 15 dials. Some populations use one combination, some use another. Africa, the mother continent, actually shows the highest genetic diversity for skin color. Even there, the story is not simple. Some African populations have evolved relatively light skin through pathways completely distinct from those used in Europe or Asia. The San people of southern Africa, for example, they have relatively light skin compared to equatorial Africans. But they didn't get it from Europe. They didn't get it from Asia. They achieved it through genetic changes that occurred independently. An invention of their own lineage. This demonstrates that skin color evolution has happened multiple times throughout human history. It is a recurring theme, a melody that the genome plays over and over again, driven by local environmental pressures, driven by genetic drift, and driven by the specific history of each group. Population bottlenecks played a crucial role in shaping these trajectories. Every time humans migrated to a new territory, they carried only a subset of the genetic variation present in their parent population. They traveled light. This meant that the raw material for evolution was different in each new environment. The toolkit was different, so the solution had to be different. This led to unique solutions to similar problems. But the story becomes even more complex. It becomes even more human, because we must consider the role of sexual selection. We are not just survival machines, we are desiring machines. Some researchers propose that once light skin began appearing in certain populations, once the mutation took hold, it may have become a preferred trait. It may have become beautiful to those who saw it. It may have become a signal for mate selection. This preference could have accelerated its spread through the population, driving the change even faster than natural selection alone would predict. Love or lust, pushing the genome forward. Archaeological evidence from burial sites hints at this social dimension. It suggests that skin color may have carried social significance even in ancient societies. Certain individuals were buried with more elaborate grave goods. They were sent into the afterlife with treasure. And genetic analysis sometimes reveals correlations between pigmentation genes and this burial treatment. We must be cautious, of course. We must be careful not to project our modern obsessions onto the ancient dead. But the patterns hint at a possibility. They hint that skin color differences were socially meaningful even in prehistoric times, even before history was written. The genetic revolution of the past decade has allowed scientists to peer directly into this past, to read the ancient DNA like a book. And what they have discovered challenges everything we thought we knew. Take the famous Lobrania individual from Spain. This 7,000-year-old Mesolithic hunter-gatherer. He lived in Europe for millennia after humans first colonized the continent. He was a European. Yet, genetic analysis reveals he carried the ancestral alleles for dark skin pigmentation. His DNA tells us that thousands of years after humans had established themselves across Europe, they still looked fundamentally African in terms of skin color. But Lobrania wasn't alone. Dozens of ancient European genomes from France, from northern Italy, from the Baltic regions, from Britain, all tell the same story. These weren't isolated cases. These weren't genetic anomalies. This was the normal appearance. This was what a European looked like for most of human history on that continent. The implications are staggering when you really sit with them. If you could travel back in time to ancient Rome, to medieval England, or even to Bronze Age Scandinavia, the people you would encounter would look nothing like the modern inhabitants of those regions. We are talking about a complete transformation of human appearance, a transformation that occurred within the span of recorded history. This raises a fundamental question, a question about how we understand diversity itself. The racial categories that seem so obvious to us, so permanent, are actually recent innovations. The pale-skinned, blonde-haired stereotype of the Northern European is a brand new development. It is a recent coat of paint on an ancient structure. The speed of this change becomes even more remarkable when the mind stops treating it like a vague, distant process and begins to imagine it as something that could be witnessed, not in the abstract, not as a colored arrow on a museum wall, but as something that unfolded village by village, generation by generation. Because genetic studies revealed that the spread of light skin alleles through European populations did not happen as a gentle trend. It happened through a combination of migration and natural selection, so powerful that it effectively overwrote the existing genetic landscape in what amounts to a few dozen generations. Just sit with that image for a moment. A continent, not empty, not silent, but populated, living, breathing, burying its dead, telling stories, raising children. And then a wave arrives. A wave of people carrying new genetic variants. They move into new lands. They intermarry. They share tools. They share seeds. They share songs. And within a span that can feel short, even on a human timeline, the physical appearance of entire regions begins to shift. Imagine being able to watch it in fast forward. Imagine standing in one place for 300 years, an impossible thought, of course, but indulge it for a moment and watching as the faces around you gradually, then rapidly begin to change. not by choice, not by culture alone, but by selection, by the invisible mathematics of survival and reproduction. The Neolithic farmers who brought agriculture to Europe were not just changing how people lived, they were changing how people looked. And that idea is worth returning to again and again because it feels almost too large to hold. They brought farming. They brought a new way of extracting calories from the land. They brought new rhythms of time, planting, harvesting, storing. But they also brought genetic mutations variants that would eventually become characteristic of European populations. And the story becomes even more complex when attention shifts from the broad sweep of migration down to the microscopic world inside the skin itself. The genes responsible for light skin do not simply turn down color like a dimmer switch. They influence how melanin is produced, packaged, and distributed within skin cells through a process called melanogenesis. Melanin production occurs in specialized cells called melanocytes. It is not a simple paint. It is a biochemical pathway, intricate, regulated, and deeply tied to other systems in the body. And the proportions of different melanin forms, eumelanin and pheomelanin, help determine not just skin color, but how skin responds to ultraviolet radiation. So, when the genetic changes occurred in European populations, they did not just make skin lighter in a cosmetic sense. They altered the way those skin cells functioned. They altered the physiology of protection. The MC1R gene acts as a master regulator in this system. It helps determine whether cells produce the dark, brown-black eumelanin or the reddish-yellow pheomelanin. And mutations in MC1R do not simply change a shade. They change the protective capacity of skin. They change how easily a person burns. They change freckling patterns. They change the response to sun exposure in ways that can shape health outcomes across a lifetime. This is one of the reasons it feels important to resist the temptation to treat skin color as mere appearance. Skin color is appearance, yes, but it is also biology. It is also a survival strategy. It is also a trade-off encoded into the body. And when the trade-off shifts, the body shifts. The genes that control pigmentation are deeply integrated with other biological systems, influencing immune function, hormone regulation, and more. And those genes do not operate alone. Recent research has revealed that pigmentation genes interact in complex ways, what might be called genetic crosstalk. The ACYP gene, for example, can modify the effects of MC1R variants, creating different phenotypes depending on which combination of alleles a person carries. This makes skin color inheritance far more complicated than simple dominant and recessive stories. It is not a single switch. It is not a single gene. It is a network. And beyond genetics, beyond the sequence of DNA itself, epigenetic mechanisms can regulate pigmentation genes without changing the underlying code. DNA methylation, histone modifications, the quiet chemical annotations of the genome that can shift gene expression based on environment, which means, again, this is not a simple story. It is never only where you come from. It is also what your body has lived through. It is what your ancestors ate. It is what sunlight reached the ground. It is what culture placed between skin and sky. And when the mind returns to the vitamin D versus folate dilemma, when it circles back as it must, the story becomes clearer but also deeper. The vitamin D deficit hypothesis reveals something profound about the constraints under which humans evolved. Humans are, in a sense, walking balancing acts. We are trying to optimize two competing biological needs at once. Too much UV can destroy folate and damage DNA. Too little UV can prevent vitamin D synthesis and lead to rickets. And this balancing act plays out differently depending on latitude, diet, clothing, and cultural practices. Populations at high latitudes with access to vitamin D-rich foods, fish marine mammals could maintain darker skin longer, even under weak sunlight. Populations that relied primarily on plant-based diets in low UV environments faced intense selection pressure for lighter pigmentation. And here again, the Inuit example returns like a refrain. The Inuit peoples of the Arctic lived in extremely low UV environments, and yet many Arctic populations maintained relatively dark skin. Why? Because their traditional diet, rich in marine mammals, provided abundant dietary vitamin D. Only when diets shifted, only when the cultural and economic systems changed, did UV levels become the primary determinant of optimal pigmentation. So the timing in Europe begins to make sense again. Hunter-gatherers could remain dark because they ate vitamin D. Farmers needed their skin to manufacture it. And once that need became severe, selection became ruthless. Archaeological evidence supports this dietary hypothesis. Stable isotope analysis of ancient bones can reveal aspects of diet, what kinds of foods sustained a person over years. And again, dietary changes seem to move alongside genetic changes related to pigmentation. As populations shifted from hunting and fishing to farming, their genetic makeup shifted too. The spread of agriculture across Europe was not just a cultural revolution, it was a biological revolution. But agriculture alone does not explain everything. And this is where the mind must widen, the frame once more must resist the urge to settle into a single cause. Climate change also played a crucial role. The end of the last ice age around 11,000 years ago altered environmental conditions across Europe and Asia dramatically. As glaciers retreated, forests expanded, and forests, unlike open plains, filter sunlight. They reduce the UV that reaches the ground. So, even without agriculture, hunter-gatherers living in dense woodlands might face vitamin D deficiency because the light itself was being softened and thinned before it touched skin. This could help explain why some pigmentation changes occurred even in non-agricultural populations. And then, once again, culture enters the equation. The complexity becomes obvious when looking at modern hunter-gatherer populations like the San people of the Kalahari Desert, who have relatively light skin despite living in a high UV environment. Part of that story involves shelter and clothing forms of UV protection that change the selection pressure. Cultural adaptations modify biological pressures. Humans are not passive recipients of environment. Humans shape environment through shelter, through clothing, through behavior, and those cultural layers change what the body must adapt to. And as the Holocene unfolded, the speed of genetic change in human populations was unprecedented in our history. Multiple genes related to diet disease resistance and physical appearance underwent rapid evolution as humans adapted to new lifestyles. Skin pigmentation was just one thread in a larger tapestry. And returning to that point, returning to it slowly from different angles, helps clarify how extraordinary this period was. Evolution under the right pressures can move fast, faster than instinct expects, faster than tradition wants to believe. And pigmentation is one of the clearest, most visible proofs. But the mind is not finished. Because even when this much becomes clear, diet, latitude, migration, forests, culture, another question lingers. What does it mean that something so socially powerful today is so biologically recent? And that question keeps echoing. It echoes as the story moves forward into other rapid evolutionary changes, into the mathematics of selection, into the strange truth that the human genome, so often imagined as fixed, is still shifting beneath the surface. And that is where the next part leads. The speed of this change becomes even more remarkable when the mind stops treating it like a vague, distant process and begins to imagine it as something that could be witnessed. Not in the abstract, not as a colored arrow on a museum wall, but as something that unfolded village by village, generation by generation. Because genetic studies reveal that the spread of light-skin alleles through European populations did not happen as a gentle trend. It happened through a combination of migration and natural selection, so powerful that it effectively overwrote the existing genetic landscape in what amounts to a few dozen generations. Just sit with that image for a moment. A continent, not empty, not silent, but populated, living, breathing, burying its dead, telling stories, raising children. And then a wave arrives. A wave of people carrying new genetic variants. They move into new lands. They intermarry. They share tools. They share seeds. They share songs. And within a span that can feel short, even on a human timeline, the physical appearance of entire regions begins to shift. Imagine being able to watch it and fast forward. Imagine standing in one place for 300 years, an impossible thought, of course, but indulge it for a moment, and watching as the faces around you gradually, then rapidly begin to change. Not by choice, not by culture alone, but by selection, by the invisible mathematics of survival and reproduction. The Neolithic farmers who brought agriculture to Europe were not just changing how people lived, they were changing how people looked. And that idea is worth returning to again and again because it feels almost too large to hold. They brought farming, they brought a new way of extracting calories from the land. They brought new rhythms of time, planting, harvesting, storing. But they also brought genetic mutations variants that would eventually become characteristic of European populations. And the story becomes even more complex when attention shifts from the broad sweep of migration down to the microscopic world inside the skin itself. The genes responsible for light skin do not simply turn down color like a dimmer switch. They influence how melanin is produced, packaged, and distributed within skin cells through a process called melanogenesis. Melanin production occurs in specialized cells called melanocytes. It is not a simple paint. It is a biochemical pathway, intricate, regulated, and deeply tied to other systems in the body. And the proportions of different melanin forms, eumelanin and pheomelanin, help determine not just skin color, but how skin responds to ultraviolet radiation. So, when the genetic changes occurred in European populations, they did not just make skin lighter in a cosmetic sense. They altered the way those skin cells functioned. They altered the physiology of protection. The MC1R gene acts as a master regulator in this system. It helps determine whether cells produce the dark brown-black eumelanin or the reddish-yellow pheomelanin. And mutations in MC1R do not simply change a shade. They change the protective capacity of skin. They change how easily a person burns. They change freckling patterns. They change the response to sun exposure in ways that can shape health outcomes across a lifetime. This is one of the reasons it feels important to resist the temptation to treat skin color as mere appearance. Skin color is appearance, yes, but it is also biology. It is also a survival strategy. It is also a trade-off encoded into the body, and when the trade-off shifts, the body shifts. The genes that control pigmentation are deeply integrated with other biological systems influencing immune function, hormone regulation, and more. And those genes do not operate alone. Recent research has revealed that pigmentation genes interact in complex ways, what might be called genetic crosstalk. The ACYP gene, for example, can modify the effects of MC1R variants, creating different phenotypes, depending on which combination of alleles a person carries. This makes skin color inheritance far more complicated than simple dominant and recessive stories. It is not a single switch. It is not a single gene. It is a network. And beyond genetics, beyond the sequence of DNA itself, epigenetic mechanisms can regulate pigmentation genes without changing the underlying code. DNA methylation, histone modifications, the quiet chemical annotations of the genome that can shift gene expression based on environment. Which means, again, this is not a simple story. It is never only where you come from. It is also what your body has lived through. It is what your ancestors ate. It is what sunlight reached the ground. It is what culture placed between skin and sky. And when the mind returns to the vitamin D versus folate dilemma, when it circles back as it must, the story becomes clearer, but also deeper. The vitamin D deficit hypothesis reveals something profound about the constraints under which humans evolved. Humans are, in a sense, walking balancing acts. We are trying to optimize two competing biological needs at once. Too much UV can destroy folate and damage DNA. Too little UV can prevent vitamin D synthesis and lead to rickets. And this balancing act plays out differently depending on latitude, diet, clothing, and cultural practices. Populations at high latitudes with access to vitamin D-rich foods, fish, marine mammals could maintain darker skin longer even under weak sunlight. Populations that relied primarily on plant-based diets in low UV environments faced intense selection pressure for lighter pigmentation. And here again, the Inuit example returns like a refrain. The Inuit peoples of the Arctic lived in extremely low UV environments, and yet many Arctic populations maintained relatively dark skin. Why? Because their traditional diet, rich in marine mammals, provided abundant dietary vitamin D. Only when diets shifted, only when the cultural and economic systems changed, did UV levels become the primary determinant of optimal pigmentation. So, the timing in Europe begins to make sense again. Hunter-gatherers could remain dark because they ate vitamin D. Farmers needed their skin to manufacture it, and once that need became severe, selection became ruthless. Archaeological evidence supports this dietary hypothesis. Stable isotope analysis of ancient bones can reveal aspects of diet, what kinds of food sustained a person over years. And again, dietary changes seem to move alongside genetic changes related to pigmentation. As populations shifted from hunting and fishing to farming, their genetic makeup shifted too. The spread of agriculture across Europe was not just a cultural revolution, it was a biological revolution. But agriculture alone does not explain everything. And this is where the mind must widen the frame, once more must resist the urge to settle into a single cause. Climate change also played a crucial role. The end of the last ice age around 11,000 years ago altered environmental conditions across Europe and Asia dramatically. As glaciers retreated, forests expanded. And forests, unlike open plains, filter sunlight. They reduce the UV that reaches the ground. So, even without agriculture, hunter-gatherers living in dense woodlands might face vitamin D deficiency because the light itself was being softened and thinned before it touched skin. This could help explain why some pigmentation changes occurred even in non-agricultural populations. And then once again, culture enters the equation. The complexity becomes obvious when looking at modern hunter-gatherer populations, like the San people of the Kalahari Desert, who have relatively light skin despite living in a high UV environment. Part of that story involves shelter and clothing forms of UV protection that change the selection pressure. Cultural adaptations modify biological pressures. Humans are not passive recipients of environment. Humans shape environment through shelter, through clothing, through behavior, and those cultural layers change what the body must adapt to. And as the Holocene unfolded, the speed of genetic change in human populations was unprecedented in our history. Multiple genes related to diet disease resistance and physical appearance underwent rapid evolution as humans adapted to new lifestyles. Skin pigmentation was just one thread in a larger tapestry. And returning to that point, returning to it slowly from different angles, helps clarify how extraordinary this period was. Evolution under the right pressures can move fast. Faster than instinct expects, faster than tradition wants to believe. And pigmentation is one of the clearest, most visible proofs. But the mind is not finished. Because even when this much becomes clear, diet, latitude, migration, forests, culture, another question lingers. What does it mean that something so socially powerful today is so biologically recent? And that question keeps echoing. It echoes as the story moves forward into other rapid evolutionary changes, into the mathematics of selection, into the strange truth that the human genome, so often imagined as fixed, is still shifting beneath the surface. And that is where the next part leads. Consider lactose tolerance. It returns here not as a distraction, but as a parallel. A reminder that the story of skin color is part of something broader. The ability to digest milk into adulthood evolved independently in multiple populations within the last 10,000 years, driven by the domestication of dairy animals. Like skin pigmentation, it represents evolution happening fast enough to be visible within human historical time. And these rapid evolutionary changes challenge the intuitive picture of evolution as slow. Most people imagine selection as a distant force creeping forward over hundreds of thousands of years. But human evolution during the Holocene tells a different story. Under strong enough pressure, dramatic genetic changes can occur within just a few thousand years. And the intensity required to drive such changes tells us something about the environments our ancestors faced. The transition to agriculture life in new climatic zones, new settlements, new disease ecologies created survival challenges so severe that they reshaped the human genome within dozens of generations. When population geneticists look at the mutations responsible for light skin in Europeans, they find signatures of positive selection so strong that these changes rank among the most dramatic examples of recent evolution in any species. These were not slow drifts. These were not neutral quirks. These were variants that offered such meaningful advantages that they spread quickly and widely. Mathematical models suggest the selective advantage of light-skin alleles in northern agricultural populations may have been enormous, possibly improving reproductive success by 10% or more per generation. Pause on that. 10% per generation. In evolutionary terms, that is not subtle. That is overwhelming. That is the difference between lineages that expand and lineages that vanish. And yet natural selection was not the only force shaping human pigmentation. The story keeps refusing simplicity. Genetic drift, random changes in gene frequency, especially in small populations, also played a crucial role. Every time humans migrated to new territories, they carried only a subset of genetic variation from their parent population. This is the population bottleneck effect, and it was especially pronounced during the initial peopling of different continents. The humans who first reached Europe, Asia, Australia, and the Americas were tiny fractions of the genetic diversity present in Africa. They were small groups, and small groups drift In small groups, chance matters more. So the raw material for evolution differed from region to region, which helps explain why Europeans and East Asians evolved lighter skin through different genetic pathways. It was not that nature preferred one gene over another. It was that different toolkits were available in different places, and yet from those different toolkits, similar solutions emerged. Again, convergent evolution. Again, the same environmental problem, producing similar outcomes through different genetic routes. This becomes even more remarkable when remembering that all non-African populations descend from what may have been a small founding group that left Africa around 70,000 years ago. From that narrow genetic foundation, humans diversified into virtually every environment on Earth. And the story is not one of clean separations. It is not one of tidy, isolated groups. It is a story of flux. The study of ancient DNA keeps revealing that human populations mixed and separated and mixed again throughout prehistory. The neat categories used today dissolve under this evidence. Instead of hard boundaries, there are gradients, transitions, overlaps, complex ancestry patterns that defy simple labels. And this matters because it changes the way the mind frames race itself. Racial categories often feel ancient, permanent, almost like nature carved them into stone. But the genetic evidence suggests something else. It suggests the categories are recent, shifting, innovations, not foundations, which brings the mind back inevitably to the staggering implication. If a person could travel back to ancient Rome, medieval England, Bronze Age Scandinavia, the faces encountered would not match modern stereotypes. The default mental image of a European is historically speaking new, and that does not diminish diversity. It reveals something more truthful. Human appearance is not fixed. It is fluid. It has been fluid, and it continues to move. But how exactly did these changes spread so effectively? How did the continent change so quickly? To answer that, attention must return again to the encounter between populations. Consider what happened when Neolithic farmers first encountered European hunter-gatherers around 8,000 years ago. It was not a sudden replacement. It was not a simple takeover. Genetic analysis suggests centuries of intermarriage and cultural exchange. Farming techniques spread alongside genes. New populations formed, combining ancestry from both groups, developing their own distinct characteristics. And the children of those mixed unions carried different combinations of variants. Some inherited the dark-skinned genes that had protected hunter-gatherer lineages for millennia. Others inherited the light-skinned variants carried by Anatolian farmers. And within a few generations, communities could contain an unprecedented range of physical appearances. A range that modern minds, trained by modern categories, may not easily imagine. But the mixing was not random. Environmental pressures shaped which variants became common. Communities practicing agriculture in northern latitudes faced intense pressure for the light-skinned variants that enabled efficient vitamin D synthesis. Those with access to vitamin D-rich foods could maintain darker pigmentation longer, even in weak sunlight. The result was not a uniform Europe. It was a patchwork, a mosaic. Villages separated by short distances might look different from one another depending on ancestry, diet, and local conditions. Physical diversity was not an exception. It was the rule. Archaeological sites sometimes reveal this surprising pattern. Burials in the same cemetery can show wildly different genetic ancestry and physical characteristics. Some individuals cluster genetically with ancient hunter-gatherers, others with Anatolian farmers. Many show mixed ancestry, yet they were buried with similar grave goods. they shared cultural practices, which suggests a provocative possibility. Physical differences may not have translated into rigid social divisions. Cultural practices, language kinship networks, these may have mattered more than skin color. It is difficult not to reflect on that. Difficult not to wonder what modern obsessions might look like from the vantage point of the ancient dead. But again, caution. Patterns are hints, not certainties. Still, the evidence invites contemplation. And the story continues to deepen when the mathematics of change is considered. Computer simulations suggest that under the selective pressures operating in ancient Europe, beneficial mutations could spread through entire populations within 50 to 100 generations. 50 to 100 generations. Fast enough that a variant appearing in one region could become common across a broader area within 2,000 years. And that rapid spread was facilitated by relatively small ancient populations. When communities contain only a few hundred individuals, genetic changes can have dramatic effects on the gene pool. Beneficial mutations can reach high frequency within a few centuries. Which brings the mind back again to the underlying point. Under severe pressure, evolution can move with startling speed. And when vitamin D deficiency could cause rickets, pelvic deformation, death in childbirth, having the right pigmentation was not just an advantage, it could be the difference between descendants and extinction. This intensity helps explain why skin color evolution can happen faster than many other adaptations. Most evolutionary changes offer small advantages. But when environmental conditions create life or death differences in survival and reproduction, evolution responds dramatically. And again, this same pattern appears elsewhere in recent human evolution. Lactose tolerance, disease resistance, rapid selection in response to pathogens. The story of skin color sits among these not alone, but as one of the most visible examples. And it remains remarkable because it happened multiple times in multiple places through different genetic tools, which returns the mind again to convergent evolution. Europeans shifting through SLC24A5 and SLC45A2. East Asians shifting through OCA2 and MFSD12. Native American populations carrying MFSD12 variants across the Bering Land Bridge into the Americas. The genome solving the same puzzle through different routes. And as this expands into the Americas, the story becomes, if possible, even more complex. Because the peopling of the Americas created another natural experiment in pigmentation. A single founding population spreading from Alaska to Chile within a few thousand years, encountering an enormous range of UV environments, tropical intensity near the equator, weak sunlight in northern latitudes, and yet because they shared a founding group, they shared a toolkit. From that shared starting point, different outcomes emerged. Some populations evolved darker pigmentation in the tropics. Others maintained lighter complexions in higher latitudes. And often the genetic mechanisms differed again from African or European pathways. Again, convergent evolution. Again, different roots, similar pressures. And then because the world always has another variable, the story adds altitude. High altitude environments intensify UV radiation. The Tibetan Plateau, the Andes, the Ethiopian highlands. Populations living at elevation face UV levels approaching those found at the equator, even at higher latitudes. This creates patterns that do not match latitude alone. Some high-altitude populations maintain relatively dark pigmentation, despite being far from the equator. Others evolved lighter skin despite intense UV exposure, which reveals the complex interplay between UV protection needs, vitamin D synthesis requirements, and other environmental constraints. And it is here, as the story reaches high altitude, that another thread appears: adaptation to oxygen scarcity. High-altitude adaptation involves variants affecting oxygen metabolism, cardiovascular function, and more. Tibetan populations show striking examples of rapid adaptation, with variants reaching high frequencies within just a few thousand years. Some of these variants may have been inherited from archaic humans, like Denisovans, which adds yet another layer to the human story. Not only migration and mixing among modern humans, but genetic inheritance from other human forms. And again, it is hard not to pause, hard not to return to the beginning. Because the story of how humans became white is not really a story about whiteness. It is a story about adaptation, about pressure, about trade-offs, about how quickly bodies can change when survival demands it. And once that becomes clear, the story does not end in the past. It turns inevitably toward the present. Because humans are still evolving. And the modern world, air pollution, dietary shifts, novel disease exposures creates new selective pressures. The evolutionary past continues to shape human biology, and the genetic changes of ancient environments continue to influence health today. Variants that evolve to help populations cope with malaria can cause sickle cell anemia in environments where malaria is absent. Lactose tolerance variants that once offered nutritional advantages can interact strangely with modern diets. The past is still in the body. And as whole genome sequencing projects expand, scientists continue to identify variants that underwent selection within the last few thousand years. Many affect traits not previously suspected to be under pressure. The story remains unfinished, which brings the mind again back to the central contemplative point. What seems permanent often is not. What seems natural often is historical. And what seems like a fixed identity may be only the latest frame in a long film of change. And that film keeps playing. The story of human skin color evolution is not ancient history in the way people often mean it. It is ancient, yes, but it is also recent. It is recent enough to unsettle modern certainties. It is recent enough that the categories built around it, socially, politically, psychologically, begin to look less like timeless truths and more like temporary arrangements. Because what the genetic evidence reveals is not a world of fixed groups. It reveals a world of motion, a world of mixing, a world where populations are always shifting, always blending, always separating, then blending again. And if that is true, if it has always been true, then the way modern minds draw sharp borders around human appearance begins to feel suspect. Not necessarily malicious, but incomplete. A simplification, a snapshot mistaken for the whole film. The technological revolution of the past 2 decades has transformed how scientists study human evolution. Scientists can now extract DNA from bones tens of thousands of years old, sometimes from fragments no bigger than a grain of rice. Genetic archaeology, a phrase that almost sounds poetic. And what it reveals is a picture of human populations in constant flux. The neat categories used today dissolve under the ancient evidence. Instead of clear boundaries, the genome shows gradual transitions. Instead of pure lineages, the genome shows complex ancestries. And this matters because it changes how the story of Europe, of whiteness, of pigmentation should be told. Consider again the encounter between Neolithic farmers and European hunter-gatherers. It was not a clean handoff. It was not a simple before and after. It was centuries of contact. Centuries of intermarriage. centuries of shared landscapes and shared bloodlines. And within those centuries, something subtle and strange likely occurred. Communities that looked different, sometimes dramatically different, could still share culture. They could share burial practices. They could share technologies, which implies that physical appearance may not have been the primary organizing principle of social identity in many ancient contexts. That possibility is not a certainty, but it is an invitation to reflect. And reflection is part of what this story demands, because the story is not just about genes. It is about the assumptions built on top of genes. It is about the human tendency to treat what is visible as what is essential. And ancient DNA does not easily support that. It supports something messier, something more human, a continuum, a gradient, a shifting field of traits. And perhaps that is why the story feels so compelling, because it not only explains how the skin changed, it reveals how quickly normal can change, how quickly a dominant phenotype can spread, how quickly stereotypes can become detached from history. And again, the mind returns to that haunting thought experiment. Travel back to ancient Rome. Travel back to medieval England. Travel back to Bronze Age Scandinavia. Look around. And what is seen is not the Europe of modern imagination. It is something else. It is darker. It is more varied. It is not aligned with modern categories. This is not to romanticize the past. It is simply to say the past was different. And the present, which often feels stable, is built on very recent outcomes. So what does it mean to know this? What changes when the story is understood? One answer is simply humility. Humility toward the body. Humility toward identity. Humility toward the fragile, shifting nature of what humans take as permanent. Another answer is curiosity. Because the story of pigmentation opens into a larger story of adaptation that is not finished. Humans are still adapting, the genome is still responding, and the pressures have changed. The pressures of ancient life, UV levels, vitamin D scarcity, folate destruction, agricultural diets were intense. Modern pressures are different, but they are real. Air pollution, dietary changes, urbanization, novel diseases, new pathogens, new environments created by technology, and it is worth returning again to the idea that humans are not passive recipients of pressure. Humans create pressure. Humans create environments that then shape selection. Clothing changes, UV exposure, shelter changes sunlight patterns, diet changes nutrient availability, technology changes disease ecologies, culture becomes biology over time. Which means the story of how humans became white is not a closed chapter. It is a case study, a preview, a lesson in how rapidly the body can shift when the environment shifts. And the environment is shifting again. Whole genome sequencing projects continue to identify variants that underwent selection in the last few thousand years. Many affect traits not suspected to be under pressure. Some relate to immune response. Some relate to digestion. Some relate to disease susceptibility. The evolutionary past continues to shape human biology in ways only beginning to be understood. And the more this becomes clear, the more the mind circles back to the central tension. We live inside bodies shaped by ancient trade-offs. We live inside genomes tuned for environments that may no longer exist. And yet those tunings remain. They can help or harm depending on context. – Variants once advantageous can become liabilities. The sickle cell example returns here as another refrain. Variants that evolved in response to malaria can cause sickle cell anemia where malaria is absent. The body carrying a weapon that in a new context can become a wound. And lactose tolerance tells a similar story. A variant that once offered major advantage in pastoralist societies can interact unpredictably with modern diets and processed foods. The genome is always responding to a world. But the world keeps changing. So, perhaps the most honest way to hold this story is not as a neat explanation, not as a simple chain, but as a living map of pressures and responses, a map that continues to update. And that brings attention back once more to what ancient DNA has truly done. It has not just filled in details, it has overturned assumptions. It has shown that modern appearance is not ancient essence. It is recent outcome. And that is uncomfortable knowledge for societies that have built rigid hierarchies around pigmentation. But it is also liberating knowledge, because it suggests that the visible boundaries we obsess over are not deeply rooted in time. They are not as inevitable as they seem. They are contingent, recent, and if they are contingent, then perhaps the meanings assigned to them are even more contingent. The story of human skin color evolution is a story of adaptation to sunlight and diet. But it is also indirectly a story about how humans attach stories to bodies, how humans build identities out of pigments, how humans forget that pigments are solutions to environmental puzzles, not markers of moral or intellectual value. And that is a thought worth circling, worth returning to, worth contemplating slowly, because it changes what the story is. It changes what it is for. And in the next part, the story returns again to the mechanism of change, migration, selection, drift, but with a deeper emphasis on what the ancient evidence really shows, a world not of separations, but of entanglements. When the mind tries to simplify human history, it usually reaches for lines, borders, before and after. This group replaced that group. This trait belongs here. This trait belongs there. But ancient DNA does not speak in lines. It speaks in overlaps. It speaks in mixtures. It speaks in human entanglement. And one of the most striking things about the last decade of genetic archaeology is how often it reveals that the past was not organized the way modern categories assume. Instead of clean separations, there were transitions. Instead of isolated populations, there were contacts. Instead of purity, there was movement. And that movement matters for skin color, because skin color is not just a response to sunlight. It is also a record of who met whom and when. It is a record of migration. It is a record of intermarriage. It is a record of genes traveling with people. Think again of Europe. The farmers from Anatolia do not simply arrive. They arrive into a world already inhabited. They do not simply replace. They blend, they mix, they merge. And in that process, the genetic variants they carry begin to circulate. Some variants spread because they are carried by expanding populations. Some spread because they are selected for by environment. Some spread partly by chance drift amplified in small communities. The genome is not moved by one force alone. It is moved by many forces at once. And the result again is a patchwork. Not a uniform transformation, not a simple gradient, but a mosaic of traits, some ancient, some new, distributed unevenly across geography and time. This is why ancient Europe could contain dark-skinned, blue-eyed individuals like Cheddar Man. It is why southern Sweden could already show light skin and blue eyes 7,700 years ago. It is why Spain could hold hunter-gatherers darker than many modern Africans. The past does not resolve into a single picture. It resolves into many pictures layered. And this is where the contemplative tone becomes necessary, not decorative, but honest. Because the truth is not quick. The truth is not efficient. The truth is complex, and complexity requires time. So it is worth returning again to the central biological tension. Folate versus vitamin D. Protection versus synthesis. Shield versus solar panel. Because that tension is what drives much of the selection. But selection does not act on populations in a vacuum. Selection acts on real communities with real diets, real clothing, real shelters, real forests overhead. So, when agriculture spreads, it changes diet drastically. When forests expand after the Ice Age, they change UV exposure. When clothing technologies develop, they change the amount of skin exposed to sunlight. When fishing practices vary, they change vitamin D intake. And each of these cultural and ecological details changes the selection pressure. So, the story of how humans became white is less like a single cause and more like a convergence. Agriculture creates vitamin D scarcity. Latitude reduces UV intensity. Forests filter UV even more. And migration introduces genetic variants that can solve the problem, all at once. And under that convergence, change accelerates. Which is why the European shift is so dramatic in ancient DNA. It is not that Europeans waited 30,000 years to get lighter and then suddenly remembered to adapt. It is that the pressure was not equally intense the whole time. The pressure changed when the way of life changed. And this is a crucial pattern to recognize, because it tells something broader about evolution. Evolution is not just about where you live. It is about how you live. How you live changes what the body must become. And as that becomes clear, the mind can circle back to another layer, sexual selection. Because once a new trait appears, once lighter skin begins to appear, social perception can amplify its spread. Preference can accelerate frequency. Not necessarily everywhere, not necessarily universally, but possibly enough to matter. And there are hints only, that skin color could have carried social meaning, even in ancient contexts. Some individuals buried with elaborate grave goods show correlations with pigmentation genes. Again, interpret cautiously. But do not ignore the possibility, because humans are storytelling animals. Humans attach meaning. Humans rank and sort and prefer. And those preferences over time can feed back into biology. Culture shaping genes. Genes shaping culture. A loop, and loops are everywhere in this story. The loop of folate and vitamin D. The loop of agriculture and diet. The loop of migration and selection. The loop of culture and biology. And perhaps that is why it feels appropriate that the narrative itself loops, returns again and again to the same questions, the same refrains. Because the subject is a loop. So ask it again. How did descendants of dark-skinned Africans become some of the lightest-skinned people on Earth? And answer it again slowly, not by cold alone, not by time alone, not by geography alone, but by a convergence of pressures, dietary shifts, UV scarcity, migration of variance, and intense selection in agricultural societies. And then ask it again in a different way. Why does the timing matter? And answer it again. Because the timing reveals the hidden cause. Because the timing points to agriculture. Because the timing exposes the role of diet. And then ask a deeper question. What does it mean that the white phenotype is so recent? and answer it again, it means that what seems timeless is not. It means that what seems essential is contingent. It means that modern stereotypes are not ancient realities. And perhaps quietly, it means that the meanings attached to pigmentation are inventions layered onto a biological adaptation. A sunscreen, a solar panel, a compromise, a trade-off, a survival strategy. And if this story is being told in the slow, immersive style of documentary reflection, then perhaps only one subtle invitation belongs here, after a major milestone. If the story feels worth thinking about, worth holding in the mind for a while, then staying with it, returning to it in later parts, is the only call that matters. Because this is not content meant to be rushed. It is a thought meant to unfold. And as it unfolds, it moves outward into the Americas, into altitude, into the genetic flexibility that allows similar outcomes through different genes. It moves toward the realization that skin color evolution happened multiple times, not once. And that realization changes the narrative again, because it means whiteness is not a single lineage story. It is an environmental story, a repeated solution. And in the next parts, that repetition, the repeated invention of lighter skin, will return again and again, not as redundancy, but as the central point. There is a temptation when hearing this story to imagine that light skin emerged once in one place and then spread outward like a single invention. But that is not what the evidence suggests. The evidence suggests something both stranger and more revealing. Light skin emerged multiple times, in different populations, through different genes, under similar pressures. That is why the East Asian story matters so much, because it interrupts the idea that Europe is the source of lightness. It shows that Europe is one path, not the path. East Asian populations evolved lighter skin through different genetic pathways. While Europeans leaned heavily on SLC24A5 and SLC45A2, East Asians involved different genes, OCA2 and MFSD12 among them, different mutations, different routes, similar outcome. And this is convergent evolution in its purest form. It is evolution demonstrating that the human genome contains multiple ways to turn down melanin production, multiple levers, multiple dials. If one lever is available in one population and another lever is available in another population, selection can pull whichever exists. The environment does not demand one specific gene, it demands an outcome, and the genome finds a route to that outcome. This tells something profound about human adaptability. When pressures are strong enough, life finds solutions. Not always the same solution, but a solution. And this matters even more when the story crosses into the Americas, because the MFSD12 story connects East Asian skin, lightning, to the peopling of the New World. After East Asians split from Europeans around 40,000 years ago, selection acted on different variants. And when ancient peoples crossed the Bering Land Bridge into North America, they carried these variants with them. Modern Native American populations still show signatures of that ancient migration, including MFSD12 variants inherited from East Asian ancestors. And then the Americas become a new stage for the same tension. UV intensity varies drastically from Alaska to Chile. Populations spread quickly. They encounter tropics and tundra desert and forest coast and mountain. And because they descend from a shared founding population, they begin with a shared toolkit. From that toolkit, different pigmentation outcomes emerge. Some populations in tropical regions evolved relatively dark pigmentation. Populations in higher latitudes maintained lighter complexions. And again, the mechanisms underlying these changes can differ from those in Africa or Europe. Again, convergent evolution. Again, the same problem solved through different routes. And if latitude were the only variable, the story might end there. But altitude complicates it. Altitude is an amplifier. At high elevation, UV intensity increases dramatically. So, high altitude environments expose human populations to UV levels approaching those near the equator, even at higher latitudes. The Tibetan Plateau, the Andes, the Ethiopian highlands. These are environments where sunlight is not simply about latitude. It is about thickness of air. It is about distance through atmosphere. Which means pigmentation patterns in high-altitude populations do not always match the simple UV latitude model. Some high-altitude populations maintain relatively dark pigmentation despite living far from the equator. Others have evolved lighter skin despite intense UV exposure. And this reveals again that pigmentation is not determined by one factor alone. It is determined by competing constraints. UV protection needs, vitamin D synthesis needs, diet, culture, and other physiological demands that altitude imposes. Because altitude is not only UV, it is oxygen scarcity, it is hypoxia, and high altitude adaptation involves genes affecting oxygen metabolism, cardiovascular function, and more. Tibetan populations show rapid adaptation, with variants reaching high frequencies within a few thousand years of settlement. And some of those variants may have been inherited from archaic humans, like Denisovans, which means that in certain environments, adaptation was not only about new mutation, it was also about ancient inheritance, genes from other human forms entering the modern human pool. The human story is again not clean. It is braided. It is layered. It is full of unexpected inheritances. And that is worth returning to because it undermines the idea that human groups are sealed containers. They never were. They have always exchanged. And that exchange is written into skin as much as into anything else. Which brings the mind back again to Africa, because Africa is often spoken of in simplistic terms, dark skin, high UV, end of story. But Africa contains the highest genetic diversity for skin color. Some African populations have evolved relatively light skin through pathways distinct from those used in Europe or Asia. The San people again stand as a reminder. Light skin is not European. It is an adaptive possibility. It has emerged under different circumstances, through different genetics, in different places. So, when the mind tries to assign pigmentation to identity, as if it were a badge of lineage rather than an adaptation, this story pushes back. It says pigmentation is a response, not a definition. Pigmentation is a solution, not a destiny. And that is a thought worth repeating because it is easy to forget. Modern societies often treat skin color as a fundamental category, but the genome treats it as a variable, a trait, a dial to be adjusted depending on pressures. And it adjusts quickly when pressures are severe, which returns again to the Holocene acceleration. The shift to agriculture did not only change pigmentation, it changed disease exposure, dense settlements, proximity to animals, new pathogens. It changed diet starches, grains, reduced nutrient diversity. It changed population size, growth expansion. It changed movement patterns, more permanent villages, but also trade routes and migrations. All of this created intense selection pressures. Skin color was one visible response, but it was part of a broader reshaping. And the more one sits with that, the more one realizes humans are not the same species in a genetic sense that left Africa 70,000 years ago. Not because we are different species, but because we are different populations shaped by different environments. We are products of countless generations of adaptation. And adaptation did not slow down, it accelerated. The transition to agriculture created more intense selective pressures than many earlier periods, and the pace of adaptation increased. Which leads to another contemplative question. If pigmentation could change so quickly within a few thousand years, then what else is changing now? What traits are being shaped by modern pressures? What variants are rising? What trade-offs are being recalibrated? The story does not answer these questions fully. It only suggests them. It only hints. Because the documentary tone is not meant to force conclusions. It is meant to leave space. So, return once more. The story of how humans became white is not only a story about Europe. It is a story about the genome's flexibility. It is a story about repeated solutions. It is a story about pressures that can rewrite the body quickly. And if that is true, then the categories built on pigmentation are not foundations. They are snapshots. And snapshots, when mistaken for the whole film, become myths. In the next parts, the story returns again to the ancient DNA revolution, how it reveals mixing, how it reveals patchworks of appearance, how it dissolves tidy categories, and then it turns toward the modern implications, health disease, and the fact that the evolutionary past still shapes bodies today. The ancient DNA revolution has done something quietly radical. It has not only given new facts, it has changed the shape of the story. Because when the past is reconstructed only from bones and tools, it is easy to imagine broad categories. Hunter-gatherers here, farmers there, a replacement, a transition. But when DNA is pulled from those bones, the past becomes more intimate. The past becomes more specific and more complicated, because now, instead of speaking about people in general, scientists can look at individuals. They can look at one person's genome and see what they carried. They can see ancestry. They can see pigmentation alleles. They can see traits that would have been invisible to archaeology alone. And again, the past looks less like a clean map and more like weather, shifting, blending, moving. Take again the example of Labranja, a Mesolithic hunter-gatherer living in Spain 7,000 years ago. Genetically, he carried alleles for dark-skin pigmentation. And this is not a small detail. It means that for thousands of years after humans were established across Europe, the baseline appearance remained in many cases closer to African ancestry than modern Europe suggests. And Labranja is not a lone outlier. Many ancient genomes across Europe tell the same story. France, northern Italy, the Baltic, Britain. Again and again, dark skin alleles persist late, which means that the light-skinned Europe of modern imagination is a recent transformation, not an ancient constant. And that realization, when it is allowed to settle, has consequences beyond science, because it changes the emotional narrative people attach to identity. It changes the story people tell themselves about belonging. It reveals that what feels native is often recent. What feels original is often a late outcome. And again, it is not about diminishing anyone's connection to place. It is about remembering time, remembering how quickly traits can spread, remembering that ancestry is not a simple story of permanence. It is a story of movement. And when movement is centered, the question becomes less, what are you, and more, what pressures shaped you. because pressure is the true protagonist of this story. UV radiation, folate destruction, vitamin D scarcity, dietary shifts, forest canopies filtering light, clothing changing exposure, migration introducing variants, selection amplifying them, drift moving them by chance. And within that complex web, the body changes. So, when modern people look at skin color and see a race, the genome sees an adaptation. When modern societies build hierarchies around pigmentation, the genome sees a balance problem. And it is worth repeating because repetition is part of understanding too much UV harms folate and DNA. Too little UV harms vitamin D synthesis. Dark skin protects, light skin synthesizes, and the optimal balance depends on environment and lifestyle. Now consider health, because the story does not remain in the past. These ancient adaptations still echo in modern bodies. Variants that evolved under one set of pressures now exist in environments that can be very different. And that mismatch can matter. It matters for disease susceptibility. It matters for drug response. It matters for physiology. This is why recent human evolution is not only an academic curiosity, it is a practical map for medicine. Because genetic variants that were once advantageous can become liabilities when the environment changes. Sickle cell is a classic example. A variant that offers protection against malaria can cause sickle cell anemia in contexts where malaria is absent. A shield in one world, a burden in another. And lactose tolerance carries similar echoes. A variant that allowed adults to digest milk, offering huge nutritional advantages in pastoral societies, can interact strangely with modern diets. The body again is tuned for a world that may no longer exist, and skin color itself is part of that tuning. Light skin increases vitamin D synthesis under low UV. But light skin also increases vulnerability to intense UV burning damage risk. Dark skin protects against intense UV, but dark skin can reduce vitamin D synthesis under weak sunlight without dietary compensation. These are trade-offs, not moral markers. Trade-offs. And knowing that does not remove the social realities built around color, but it reveals their arbitrariness. It reveals their lack of deep biological justification. Because biology is not endorsing hierarchy. Biology is solving problems. And it has solved them in different ways in different places repeatedly. And if one returns again to the mechanism of rapid change, the intensity becomes visible. Population genetics suggests strong selection, possibly 10% increased reproductive success per generation for beneficial alleles in certain contexts, 50 to 100 generations for variants to spread through populations under the right conditions. 2,000 years. A blink. And again, small population sizes accelerate these processes. When communities contain only a few hundred individuals, allele frequencies can shift dramatically. Drift can amplify change. Selection can sweep quickly. And migration can introduce new variants that then become favored. So, the past is not stable, it is dynamic, which makes modern attempts to treat pigmentation as a stable, eternal category feel misguided, because even within Europe, the transformation is recent. And even across the world, similar transformations arose independently. So, what is the deeper conclusion? Not a political conclusion, not a moral sermon, just the quiet, reflective conclusion that the evidence invites human appearance is the visible surface of hidden pressures. And those pressures change. And when they change, the surface changes. which means that the human story is not a story of fixed types. It is a story of adaptation. Now again, return to the beginning. Return to that opening question, how did humans become white? And answer it again gently with more context. Humans became white in some regions because the balance between folate protection and vitamin D synthesis shifted under new diets, new environments, and new cultural practices. And because genetic variants that reduced pigmentation, introduced by migration or existing as mutations, were favored strongly under those conditions. And because the process unfolded rapidly within the recent past. And then ask the question again in another form. How real are the categories built around skin color? And the evidence suggests they are real as social forces, but biologically they are shallow, they are recent, they are contingent, they are not deep divisions carved into the species. They are local solutions, which leads again to the final lingering thought that keeps returning. What we consider normal today is just one frame, just the latest frame, a frame that will someday be the past. And humans are still evolving, still adapting, still shifting. Modern environments create new pressures, air pollution, dietary change, disease exposure. These may drive future genetic changes. And if the past is any guide, under strong pressure, change can happen faster than intuition expects. So, the story ends, if it ends at all, not with a closed conclusion, but with an open horizon. The human genome is still in motion, and the meaning humans attach to pigment is still a story humans are writing. In the next parts, the narrative returns once more to that openness, to the sense that the story of pigmentation is not only about where humans came from, but about where humans might be going. There is a quiet irony in this story. Skin color, one of the most visible traits humans possess, feels to many people like one of the most solid, one of the most obvious, one of the traits that seems to divide the world into categories that feel natural, ancient, inevitable. And yet the genetic evidence suggests almost the opposite. It suggests that pigmentation is fluid. It suggests that pigmentation has changed repeatedly. It suggests that pigmentation can shift quickly under the right pressures. And it suggests that the categories built around pigmentation are not ancient structures of nature. They are recent interpretations layered onto a biological trade-off. So when the mind tries to hold the story, it helps to return to the central tension once more, because it is the anchor. Vitamin D must be synthesized in skin under UV. Folate must be protected from UV destruction. Dark skin protects folate. Light skin increases vitamin D synthesis. And the optimal balance depends on environment, diet, and culture. And when any of these variables shift, diet shifts with agriculture, environment shifts with climate, culture shifts with clothing and shelter, the optimal pigmentation can shift too. And it did dramatically, which means the human story is one of continuous adjustment. Even the classic image of Northern Europeans' very pale skin, blonde hair appears only in the last few thousand years. That is the startling implication. Not only is light skin recent, but the stereotype is recent. And that matters because it suggests that the present is not the baseline. The present is an outcome. Now, consider again how ancient DNA has changed the narrative. It has allowed scientists to look directly at the past, not to guess, not to infer from artifacts alone, but to read the genetic signatures of real individuals. And those signatures keep contradicting modern assumptions. Cheddar man, dark skin, blue eyes. Spanish hunter-gatherers, very dark skin. Southern Sweden, early light skin variants. A patchwork across Europe. And then the farmer wave, Anatolian farmers spreading agriculture and light skin alleles. By 8,000 years ago, variants spreading. By 5,000 years ago, common. By 3,000 years ago, predominant. Again, the pace is the point. The pace reveals the intensity of selection, and selection intensity reveals the severity of pressure. So, what was the pressure? Vitamin D deficiency, rickets, pelvic deformation, childbirth difficulty, reduced reproductive success. In pre-modern contexts, those were not minor issues. They were decisive. And under decisive pressures, evolution does not whisper. It shouts. Now, another layer returns small population size. Ancient communities were small. In small communities, drift can produce large effects. Beneficial mutations can spread quickly. Migration can reshape gene pools. A few hundred people carrying a variant into a region can change the future appearance of millions, which feels almost unbelievable. But that is what population genetics suggests. And when the mind accepts that another question emerges, if bodies can change so quickly under pressure, what does that say about the future? This is where the narrative naturally turns toward modern pressures. Not to predict specific outcomes, not to invent new facts, but to acknowledge that pressures exist. Air pollution, dietary changes, novel disease exposures, urban environments, technological environments. These create new selective landscapes, and humans are still evolving within them. Which means that the story of pigmentation is not an isolated historical curiosity. It is part of a broader truth: humans are not finished. And perhaps that is the deepest reason this story matters, because it reveals that what humans often treat as fixed identity is at the biological level a moving target shaped by pressures, and pressures change. Now, after another major milestone, only one small, subtle reminder belongs here. If this pace, this atmosphere, this looping contemplation is what you came for, then staying with the remaining parts is the best way to let the story land. Not as trivia, but as perspective. Because perspective is what this story offers. And the story continues. It returns again to convergence Europe and East Asia, evolving light skin through different genes. It returns again to the Americas, a founding group, spreading across 2 continents, pigmentation shifting with UV. It returns again to altitude UV intensity, increasing with elevation, complicating latitude-based expectations. It returns again to Africa, highest diversity, independent evolution of lighter pigmentation in some groups. Each return reinforces the central point: pigmentation is adaptation, not essence. And as the narrative approaches its later sections, it returns again to the dissolving of neat categories. The neat categories modern humans use to describe populations do not hold up well against ancient genetic evidence. Instead of clean divisions, there are gradients and mixtures. Instead of isolated lineages, there are braided ancestries. And that braided ancestry changes how belonging should be imagined. Because belonging is not a gene. Belonging is not pigment. Belonging is lived. Belonging is cultural. Belonging is story. And the irony is that humans often use pigment as if it were proof of belonging. But pigment is proof of adaptation, proof of pressure, proof of environment, proof of trade-offs. And those proofs do not map neatly onto social identities. So, the story ends where it began, with a question. How did humans become white? And a second question hidden inside it, what does it mean that we did? And the evidence suggests it means humans adapt quickly. It means humans change in visible ways within short timescales. It means the categories built around appearance are recent and unstable. It means the human story is more fluid than modern narratives allow. And if that is true, then perhaps the only honest posture is contemplation. To look at the skin, any skin, and see not a label, but a history of pressures, a history of sunlight, a history of diet, a history of movement, a history of survival. And then, inevitably, to wonder, what pressures are shaping the next chapter? The mind keeps wanting a single explanation, one cause, one simple chain that turns dark into light. But the story refuses that simplicity, because the story is not a single chain. It is a web, and webs require time to trace. So trace it again slowly from the beginning. Humans lose body hair, they sweat, they become endurance hunters. Hairless skin becomes exposed to intense tropical UV. UV destroys folate. Folate is essential for reproduction. So, melanin is selected strongly. Dark skin becomes necessary, that is one arc. Then humans migrate out of Africa. They carry dark skin with them. They move into weaker sunlight. Vitamin D synthesis becomes harder. But hunter-gatherer diets provide dietary vitamin D fish marine mammals. So the pressure to lighten is not yet overwhelming. Then agriculture spreads. Diet shifts to plant-heavy foods. Dietary vitamin D declines. Suddenly, vitamin D deficiency becomes severe. Rickets threatens survival and childbirth. Selection pressure intensifies. Light skin alleles spread rapidly. That is another arc. Then climate shifts. Ice age ends. Forests expand. UV reaching the ground decreases in woodland environments. Selection for lighter skin can increase even without agriculture in certain contexts. That is another arc. Then culture intervenes. Clothing, shelter, behavior. These modify UV exposure and vitamin D intake. Culture changes selection. That is another arc. Then migration and mixing. Neolithic farmers and hunter-gatherers intermarry. Variants move between populations. Patchworks emerge. That is another arc. Then drift. Small populations. Founder effects. Bottlenecks. Randomness amplifying certain alleles. That is another arc. And then convergence. Europe evolves lighter skin through SLC24A5 and SLC45A2. East Asia evolves lighter skin through other genes like OCA2 and MVESD12. Similar pressures, different pathways. That is another arc. And then the Americas. East Asian derived variants carried across the Bering Land Bridge. A founding population spreads across 2 continents. Pigmentation outcomes shift with UV conditions. That is another arc. And then altitude. UV intensity rises with elevation. Tibet Andes, Ethiopian highlands. Pigmentation patterns become complex. High-altitude adaptation genes interact with pigmentation contexts. Some variants may come from Denisovans. That is another arc. When all of these arcs are held together, the story becomes less about how humans became white and more about how humans continuously calibrate the body to the environment. Which is why the phrase became white is, in a way, misleading, because humans did not become white universally. Humans became lighter in certain places under certain pressures through certain genetics. And in other places, humans remained darker because the pressures favored protection, or because diet compensated, or because culture changed exposure, or because different solutions emerged. So, the story is not a march toward whiteness. It is a map of adaptations. And that is important because narratives matter. If the story is misframed as a destination, as if whiteness were an endpoint, then the story becomes distorted. But if the story is framed as calibration adjustment compromise, then the story becomes clearer, because the body is always compromising, always trading one risk for another, always balancing. Folate versus vitamin D, UV damage versus UV scarcity, protection versus synthesis, and the balance point shifts when life changes. Now return again to the startling revelation that Europeans were still dark-skinned well into recorded history. This detail matters not only as a surprise, but as a lesson. Even traits that feel deeply associated with a region today may be recent. Even traits that feel native can be new, which means that the cultural narratives built around those traits, ideas of original people, true identity, ancient purity, need to be held lightly, because the genome suggests movement, not purity. And ancient DNA suggests mixing, not isolation. And if that is true, then modern racial categories become what they truly are: social constructs built on visible variation, not deep biological divisions. Again, the social reality is real. The consequences are real. But the biological foundation for strict categories is shallow, recent, and unstable over time. Which brings the story back to its contemplative center. What humans treat as permanent is often temporary. What humans treat as essence is often adaptation, and adaptation is always responsive, which means the present world too will leave its mark, not in the same way, not necessarily in visible traits like skin color, but in some way. Because selection does not stop simply because humans have technology. Selection changes shape. Modern medicine alters survival outcomes. But modern environments introduce new pressures, and humans still reproduce within those pressures. So the genome continues to move. And perhaps the deepest takeaway of the pigmentation story is not the details of SLC24A5 or MFSD12. It is the reminder that humans are a dynamic species, still changing, still adapting, still shaped by the invisible forces of environment, diet, and culture. And that leads naturally, as the narrative nears its conclusion, to the idea that understanding the past does not diminish human diversity. It reveals the true scope of human adaptability. It reveals that diversity is not a static set of categories, but a living process. A process unfolding through time. And when that is understood, the story becomes less about separation and more about connection. Because all non-Africans descend from a small group that left Africa. Because pigmentation adaptations emerged repeatedly from shared human biology. Because the same molecules, folate, vitamin D, melanin, shape bodies everywhere. Because the same pressures, UV diet climate press on all humans differently but universally. So perhaps the truest way to hold the story is not as how humans became white, but as how humans learned again and again to negotiate the sun. And that negotiation continues. If the story ended here, it would already be enough to change how many people think about human difference. But the story does not end neatly. It does not close like a book. Because the central revelation that pigmentation is recent, flexible, repeatedly evolved does not sit still. It keeps pointing outward. It keeps suggesting implications. And some of those implications are scientific, some are medical, some are philosophical. The medical implication returns first because it is concrete. Understanding recent human evolution helps explain patterns of disease susceptibility and physiological variation that affect treatment today. Genetic variants evolved under specific ancient pressures and still shape modern health outcomes. The past is not past inside the body. It is active, it is present, and skin color, again, is part of that. Vitamin D synthesis remains a real biological process. UV exposure remains real. Diet remains real. The ancient trade-off still operates, even if modern lifestyles alter how it plays out. And the story of pigmentation can serve as a reminder that optimal traits are context-dependent. A trait beneficial in one environment can become a liability in another. And this applies across genetics. Sickle cell returns again as a reminder. Lactose tolerance returns again. Variants evolved under one selective landscape now exist in different landscapes. Modern environments can expose mismatches. And those mismatches can shape health. But beyond medicine, there is a deeper implication about identity. Because humans are storytelling creatures. Humans build categories. Humans build hierarchies. Humans build myths of origin and belonging. And pigmentation has been used again and again as if it were a sign of something deeper than adaptation, as if it were proof of essence. But ancient DNA suggests that pigmentation is not a stable essence. It is a moving trait. And if pigmentation is moving, then the meanings built on it are even more fragile, which does not erase those meanings. It does not erase the social forces that have been constructed. But it changes how the story should be told. It changes what kind of reverence the categories deserve. Because if the categories are recent, then the hierarchies built around them are not grounded in deep time. They are grounded in recent history, in culture, in power, in narrative, not in biology. And again, it is worth repeating, the genome does not validate hierarchy. The genome validates adaptation. The genome validates survival strategies. The genome records pressures, not moral worth. And if one sits with that long enough, the story begins to feel less like a fact about Europe and more like a lesson about the human tendency to mistake surface for depth. The surface changes quickly. The surface responds. The surface is shaped by needs. And yet humans often treat the surface as destiny. So the story invites a different view, a slower view, a view that sees the skin as a map of sunlight histories, a map of diets, a map of movements, a map of ancient solutions. And the mind returns once more to the ancient DNA revolution, because it is what allows this to be seen so clearly. Without it, the story might still be told in broad strokes. But with it, the story becomes undeniable. Europeans were dark-skinned, late. Light skin spread rapidly with agriculture. Different populations evolved light skin independently. Africa contains wide diversity. Native Americans carry East Asian-derived variants. High-altitude populations complicate latitude models. These details dismantle simplistic narratives. They dismantle the idea that human groups are fixed, sealed categories. Instead, the past reveals humans as a species that moves, mixes, and adapts rapidly when pressured. And that is perhaps the most important point to return to one last time from a different angle. The human story is not a story of separated branches growing in isolation. It is a story of braided rivers, streams that diverge and rejoin, mix and separate, carry different sediments, and yet remain part of one system. So what does it mean emotionally to accept that? For some it may feel destabilizing, for some it may feel liberating, for some it may feel irrelevant. But the story remains true regardless of feeling. And truth in this case asks the mind to loosen its grip on fixed categories, to recognize that human diversity is real, but not in the simplistic ways often imagined. Diversity is real as variation, but it is not proof of separate human types in a deep biological sense. It is proof of adaptation within one species, and that is a quieter, deeper kind of unity. Not the unity of sameness, but the unity of shared biological constraints, shared trade-offs, shared molecules, shared pressures. And the last implication returns again to the future. Humans are still evolving. Modern environments create new selective pressures. Air pollution, diet, novel disease exposures. The story does not claim certainty about what will change, but it reminds that change is possible, and change can be rapid. So, in a sense, the story of pigmentation is a preview, not of whiteness spreading, but of evolution continuing, of bodies adjusting, of genomes responding. And if this is the frame, then the story becomes not only about what happened, but about what is always happening. Humans adapting, humans balancing, humans changing. And with that, the narrative approaches its final return to the opening question, now carrying all the loops and layers. How did humans become white? And what does it mean that we did return to the beginning, return again? Because the only way to truly understand a story like this is to loop back through it slowly, reflectively, until the pieces stop feeling like facts and begin to feel like a coherent shape. There was a moment in human evolution that changed the way humans look at one another. A transformation so visible that it became a social force, and yet biologically it was a practical response. A response to sunlight, a response to diet, a response to survival. About 70,000 years ago, a small group of humans left Africa. They were dark-skinned, all of them, melanin-rich, deeply pigmented, carrying a genetic inheritance shaped by intense tropical UV. That dark skin existed because the early humans lost their body hair, became heavy sweaters, exposed bare skin to UV, and faced folate destruction. Folate mattered for reproduction, so melanin was selected strongly. Dark skin became essential. Then humans moved north. And in the north, the trade-off began to shift. Vitamin D made in skin under UV became harder to synthesize under weak sunlight. But for a long time, hunter-gatherer diets compensated. Fish, marine mammals, game. Dietary vitamin D allowed darker skin to persist at higher latitudes. So the simple story, dark in the tropics, light in the north, did not unfold immediately. It took time because the pressure was not yet severe enough. And then agriculture arrived, and everything changed. Diet shifted toward plants and grains. Dietary vitamin D diminished. Vitamin D deficiency became a real threat. Rickets, pelvic deformation, childbirth complications. Selection pressure intensified dramatically, and light skin alleles carried by migrating Neolithic farmers and amplified by selection spread rapidly through European populations. SLC24A5, SLC45A2. variance sweeping through the continent within a few thousand years, so quickly that in evolutionary terms it was yesterday. And ancient DNA confirms the timeline. Europeans were still dark-skinned late. Cheddar man, dark skin, blue eyes. Spanish hunter-gatherers extremely dark. Southern Sweden, early exceptions. A patchwork before the sweep. Then the sweep. Then a Europe that begins to resemble modern expectations. But Europe was not alone. East Asian populations faced similar pressures and evolved lighter skin through different genes. OCA2, MFSD12. Convergent evolution, similar outcomes through different genetic routes. And that matters because it shows that light skin is not the signature of one lineage. It is a repeated solution, a repeated response to similar environmental constraints. And the story extends into the Americas. Variance carried across the Bering Land Bridge, a founding population spreading from Alaska to Chile. Pigmentation shifting under different UV conditions, sometimes through different mechanisms again. And then altitude complicates everything. UV intensity increases with elevation. Tibet, Andes, Ethiopian highlands. Pigmentation patterns do not map cleanly to latitude. High-altitude adaptation introduces other genetic pressures, oxygen metabolism, and may include archaic inheritance, like Denisovan variants. The story keeps refusing neatness, and Africa, the origin, remains the most diverse. Africa shows high genetic diversity for skin color. Some African populations have lighter skin through independent pathways, reminding again that pigmentation is not a simple map of continent and identity. It is a dynamic trait, shaped repeatedly. And the final layer returns again: culture, clothing, shelter, diet, behavior. Humans modify their environments. Those modifications change selection pressures. Culture becomes biology over time. And then the story touches the present because it cannot avoid it. The evolutionary past still shapes human biology. Variants selected for ancient pressures still influence health today. The sickle cell example, the lactose tolerance example, the broader truth that adaptation can become mismatch when environments change. And modern environments are changing. Air pollution, dietary shifts, novel disease exposures, new pressures. Humans are still evolving. Not in a dramatic cinematic way that can be watched day to day. But in the quiet way, evolution always works through differential reproduction, through subtle shifts in allele frequencies over generations. So, the story of how humans became white is not only about the past. It is a reminder that human identity, when built on biology, must be held with humility. Because biology is not static, and what seems permanent is often recent, and what seems like destiny is often adaptation. So, ask the question, one last time, slowly: how did humans become white? And answer it without rushing. Humans became lighter-skinned in certain regions because the balance between UV protection and vitamin D synthesis shifted under new environments, new diets, and new cultural practices, especially agriculture, creating intense selection for variants that reduced melanin production. And then ask the deeper question, the one that lingers after the science. What does it mean that this happened so recently? It means that the visible categories humans often treat as ancient are not ancient. They are late outcomes. It means that the stereotypes of what people look like in a region can be historically shallow. It means that modern racial categories do not reflect deep biological divisions, but recent distributions of adaptable traits. And perhaps most quietly, it means this: human beings are not fixed. We are a species in motion. We have always been in motion, moving across continents, mixing, adapting, changing. The skin is not just a surface. It is a history of sunlight, a history of food, a history of migrations, a history of survival. And if that history is held carefully slowly, then the story does not end with whiteness or darkness. It ends with a larger recognition. The human body is an ongoing negotiation with the world, and the world keeps changing, so the negotiation continues.